if you write Gary Schmidt a letter, he will write you back. Even if, and this is a true story, you are an entire fourth grade class whose assignment is to write him and tell him what you think should be improved or changed in his Newbery-winning and Prince Award-winning novel. He will still thank you for your letter and respond graciously. Gary has received the highest honors available in young adult literature, but he is still a very kind and generous person. And I can say this after only knowing him for a little over 24 hours. Those of you who attended the Nan Osmond Gross lecture know that Gary is committed to children's literature as well as children themselves. And today Gary is going to talk about beginnings, and so I wanted to share a few facts or beginnings about Gary. Number one, he writes all his drafts on a typewriter. He likes the way the words go on the page, and he likes to see the progress of the pile of pages getting bigger. Sometimes he will also cut the pages up and rearrange them in the story. Number two, when he first writes a story, he names all his characters Avi. Then he goes back and changes the names once he finds a name that really fits. Number three, he begins each story with the voice of the narrator. Once he has that in his head, he decides where the time and place will be. And he doesn't outline his stories. Rather, he says he wants to be able to discover with his characters, what is going to happen. And it's not brain surgery. You don't have to get it right the first time. Number four, he was 26 before he ever conceived of writing a novel. When he was younger, he said he hated reading, and he was one of the worst readers in his class. And even now, as a 2-time Newbery Honor winner and a Prince Award winner, when he meets people on the plane and they ask what he does, he says he's a teacher. Number five, he started his first young adult novel late one night when he was working on his PhD dissertation. He just finished translating a bunch of Latin prayers when he hit a key on his computer and they suddenly erased, which might be why he writes on a typewriter now. But he said he couldn't bring himself to start all over again, and so he wrote a young adult novel. And while he says it was terrible and it didn't get published, I'm sure it was excellent. Number six, when Gary first started out to write Lizzie Bright and the Buckminster Boy, which won the Newbery Honor and the Prince Award, there was only a small pamphlet and an article in an old newspaper recognizing the injustice suffered by the African Americans who were evicted from the Malaga Island in Maine. However, since the publishing of Lizzie Bright, the governor of Maine has recently issued a formal apology to the descendants of Benjamin Darling. And while I know that Gary would never take any credit for this historical moment, I believe that his book helped spread awareness of this event. We are honored to have Gary here, both for his talent as a writer and his quality as an individual. Please join me in welcoming Gary Schmidt.
Thank you, and thank you for coming. That first book really was awful. It really was terrible. So no one here will ever read it. No one will ever see it. It will be destroyed someday. I don't know. I work in a building that's heated with a wood stove, and you always need kindling. Let's start with a story. Do you mind if is this okay? In the Holocaust, stories were told in the barracks. These are not the stories of the witnesses that we tend to hear. It's not the Anne Frank stories. But as other things were done, like poetry, like plays, like music, children's stories, cookbooks, as those were being crafted, so too there were stories that were being told in the barracks by those who were essentially waiting to die. The story I'm going to tell you comes from Auschwitz. It survived only because a survivor made it out and lived for a short time in eastern Poland, where after the war there continued to be pogroms. Eventually he fled Poland and came to the Catskill Mountains, where he told this story to a cellist in the New York Philharmonic whose son went to my school. He told it to his son told it to me, and now I'll tell it to you. So you are 5 tellers away from the original events of this story. It's sort of like being 5 tellers away from Hansel and Gretel's first telling. And that's where you'll be by the time this is finished. There was a man named Salak. Salak has been in Auschwitz for 6 months. No one survives Auschwitz for more than 6 months. No one. Salak has made it this far because at night he climbs up to the third tier of the bunk and he throws his legs over and he holds his hands up and he plays his violin. He plays the Corelli duet, top line. He doesn't have a violin and he doesn't have a bow, but he plays nonetheless, closes his eyes. And he plays the whole piece. It is so beautiful. It is so filled with joy. And he hears every note, but no one else does. And they look at him in the darkness, playing away, and they think, he's crazy. He's lost it. Every night, Salak plays the Corelli duet, top line, eyes closed. So beautiful, so filled with joy. One night, the lights come on in the middle of the night. The guards come in, the boots, the dogs, the bayonets, and numbers are called. And Salak rolls his arm up the sleeve of his shirt to follow his tattooed number, to see if his number is going to be called that night and if he will walk through the dark door at the end of the barracks and be part of the quota. And on that night, and he is sure this is going to be his night, on that night, his number is not called. But the numbers of half the souls in that barracks are. And they march out through the door, and when the lights go out again, Salak does not sleep. He gets up, throws his legs over, holds his arms, hands up, and he plays his violin. He hears every note. The next day, a new group of souls is marched into the barracks, and he watches from his bed, watches them come in. And he sees, he can't believe this, he sees coming right down the middle aisle, it's impossible, but there it is, the master musician of Prague, this master violinist. There he is, walking right down the center aisle. This man who plays music like the voice of God. No one can touch him. He can't believe it. And the master violinist walks down the center aisle and comes to the very barracks the very bunk where Salak is, and on the other side. He starts to climb up. He gets right across from Salak. And Salak says to him, "Master." But the master violinist of Prague does not even look at him, and he does not say anything. Auschwitz is about silence. And he closes his eyes. That night, Salak calls again across the aisle, "Master," but there is no response. And the next night, and the next, and the next. And so it goes. And the master violinist of Prague never acknowledges. Until one night, Salak does not try and call him. He throws his legs over the bed. He holds up his hands. He closes his eyes. And he begins to play Corelli duet, top line. It is so beautiful. It is so filled with joy. And when he is finished, he opens his eyes and he looks across to the master violinist of Prague, who is looking at him, and who then speaks his first word in Auschwitz. The word is this: again. And he holds up his hands. They played that night together. The master violinist of Prague played the top line. He's the master. Salak took the bottom line. And they played. And that night, everyone in the barracks heard the Corelli duet. The next night they played again. And everyone in the barracks heard every single note. And the guards outside the barracks heard the note. And the next night, they played again. And the commandant in his office, so far away with his dogs, he heard the notes. And the next night, when the people of the town of Auschwitz, who were working so hard to pretend that what was happening was not happening, they heard the notes too. And night after night, the notes were played. Until another night came when the lights come on. The guards, the boots, the bayonets, the dogs, and numbers are called, and Salak rolls up his sleeve to watch. And another miracle. His number is not called. He can't believe it. And he looks across at the master violinist, who is rolling his sleeve down, whose face is white, and whose number has been called. Salak jumps down into the aisle. The master violinist begins to climb down. Salak crosses the aisle, looks up at the master violinist, and says to him, "Stay." And the master violinist looks down at him, and he thinks, "Can I take this gift?" No. No one can take such a gift. No one can take such a gift. And he continues to climb down, and Salak says to those on the bunks, "Hold him." And they do. They pin the master violinist to his bunk, and Salak walks down the aisle and through the dark door. Salak fills the quota that night. The master violinist survived. He was there when Auschwitz was liberated. He became famous across all of Europe. He came to America and played in San Francisco and in Chicago and in New York, Carnegie. Everywhere he went, he received acclaim. And he would end his concerts the same way, every single one. He would step to the front of the stage and he would play the Corelli duet. He would play the bottom line. And the people in the audience would watch him and they would think, what a strange choice. And the bottom line. And look at him. He's weeping. It must be because it's so beautiful. It must be because it's so filled with joy. That's a story. There are many stories like that. There are many stories like that, most of which are dying out more quickly than we can imagine, that are true folk tales from that period. And those are the kinds of stories I grew up on. I thought today for the reading that I would read a couple of beginnings to get a sense of how things open and to give in young adult literature what some of the options are. And so what I thought I would do is to read some that seem to affirm the rules and one that breaks them, and then one that is not yet published, and then one that is still in rough draft. It's always cool to read something that's in rough draft because if it stinks, you can say, well, it's just a first draft, and you get away with so much from that. So this is a book called Wednesday Wars. And in the opening here, what I'm interested in doing is two things: to establish the voice, to get this kid's voice going, and to set up the initial dramatic question, which is how is this kid going to survive since he has an afternoon alone with a teacher who hates his guts. That's the kind of problem I want to set up. In young adult literature, you're often told to explode into the story, which I think is a nice verb. I don't think this does this. But those are the two things I'm trying to do. Of all the kids in the 7th grade at Camillo Junior High, there was one kid that Mrs. Baker hated with heat whiter than the sun. Me. And let me tell you, it wasn't for anything I'd done. If it had been Doug Swiatek that Mrs. Baker hated, it would have made sense. Doug Swiatek once made up a list of 410 ways to get a teacher to hate you. It began with spray deodorant in all her desk drawers and got worse as it went along. A lot worse. I think that things became illegal around number 167. You don't want to know what number 400 was, and you really don't want to know what number 410 was. But I'll tell you this much. They were the kinds of things that sent kids to juvenile detention homes in upstate New York so far away that you never saw them again. Doug Swiatek tried number 6 on Mrs. Sidman last year. It was something about Wrigley gum and the teacher's water fountain, which was just outside the teacher's lounge, and the Polynesian fruit blend hair coloring that Mrs. Sidman used. It worked, and streams of juice, the color of mangoes, stained her face for the rest of the day, and the next day, and the next day, until I suppose those skin cells wore off. Doug Swiatek was suspended for 2 whole weeks. Just before he left, he said that next year he was going to try number 106 to see how much time that would get him. The day before Doug Swiatek came back, our principal reported during morning announcements that Mrs. Sidman had accepted voluntary reassignment to the main administrative office. We were all supposed to congratulate her on her new post, but it was hard to congratulate her because she almost never peeked out of the main administrative office. Even when she had to be the playground monitor during recess, she kept away from us. If you did get close, she'd whip out a plastic rain hat and pull it on. It's hard to congratulate someone who's holding a plastic rain hat over her Polynesian fruit blend hair color. That's the kind of stuff that gets teachers to hate you. But the thing was, I never did any of that stuff. Never. I even stayed as far away from Doug Swiatek as I could. So if he did decide to try number 106 on anyone, I wouldn't get blamed for standing nearby. But it didn't matter. Mrs. Baker hated me. She hated me a whole lot worse than Mrs. Sidman hated Doug Swiatek. I knew it on Monday, the first day of 7th grade, when she called the class roll, which told you not only who was in the class, but also where everyone lived. If your last name ended in Berg, or Zog, or Stein, you lived on the north side. If your last name ended in Ellie, or Innie, or O, you lived on the south side. Lee Avenue cut right between them. And if you walked out of Camillo Junior High and followed Lee Avenue across Main Street, past McLean's drugstore and Goldman's Best Bakery and the 5 and 10 cent store, and then another block and past the Free Public Library and down one more block, you come to my house, which my father had figured out was right smack in the middle of town. Not on the north side, not on the south side, somewhere in between. It's the perfect house, he said. But perfect or not, it was living in between. On Saturday morning, everyone north of us was at Temple Bethel. Late on Saturday afternoon, everyone south of us was at Mass at St. Adelbert's, which had gone modern and figured that it didn't need to wake parishioners up early. But on Sunday morning, early, my family was at St. Andrew's, listening to Pastor McClellan, who was old enough to have known Moses. This meant that out of the whole weekend, there was only Sunday afternoon left over for full baseball teams. This hadn't been too much of a disaster up until now, but last summer, Ben Cummings moved to Connecticut so his father could work in Groton, and Ian McAllister moved to Biloxi so his father could be a chaplain at the base there instead of pastor at St. Andrews, which is why we ended up with Pastor McClellan, who could have called Isaiah a personal friend, too. So being a Presbyterian was now a disaster, especially on Wednesday afternoons, when at 1:45 sharp, half of my class went to Hebrew school at Temple Bethel, and at 1:55, the other half went to catechism at St. Adelbert's. This left behind just the Presbyterians, of which there had been 3, and now there was 1, me. I think Mrs. Baker suspected this when she came to my name on the class roll. Her voice got kind of crackly, like there was a secret code in the static beneath it. "Holling Hood," she said. "Here," I raised my hand. Hood. Yes. Mrs. Baker sat on the edge of her desk. They should have sent me some sort of a message, since teachers aren't supposed to sit on the edge of their desks on the first day of classes. There's a rule about that. Hood, she said quietly. She thought for a moment. "Does your family attend Temple Bethel?" she said. I shook my head. "St. Adelbert's, then?" She asked this kind of hopefully. I shook my head again. "So on Wednesday afternoon you attend neither Hebrew school nor catechism?" I nodded. "You are here with me?" "I guess," I said. Mrs. Baker looked hard at me. I think she rolled her eyes. Since the mutilation of guess into an intransitive verb is a crime against the language, perhaps you might wish a full sentence to avoid prosecution, something such as, "I guess that Wednesday afternoons will be busy after all." That's when I knew she hated me. This look came over her face, like the sun had just winked out and was never going to shine again until next June. That sets up the scene that he is, in fact, there Wednesday afternoons with his teacher all by himself, and she hates him because, of course, if he was Jewish or Catholic, he's gone. Which, by the way, is all true. Everything I just read to you could be autobiography. This is a book called Trouble. You are told in middle grade fiction or young adult fiction that you must begin with some action, with something happening. And so after having done a few of those, I thought, I wonder if I could get away with it. I wonder if I could sort of slip this past my editor and not do it. How long could I keep going on these first few pages without having anything happen, with no action, no sense of here's what the plot's all about? How can I do it? And would my editor let me do it? So this was an experiment. It's all description pretty much. It's exactly the opposite of what you're supposed to do in young adult fiction. But I got away with it. Henry Smith's father told him that if you build your house far enough away from trouble, then trouble will never find you. So the Smiths lived where their people had lived for exactly 300 years, far away from trouble, in Blytheberry by the sea, where the currents of the Atlantic give up their last southern warmth to the coast of Massachusetts before they head to the cold granite shores of Maine. From the casement windows of his bedroom, Henry could look out over the feathery waves, and on sunny days, and it seemed as if all his life there had only been sunny days, he could open the leaded glass doors and walk out onto a stone balcony, and the water would glitter all the way to the horizon. Henry's first word had been blue. The first taste he could remember was salt water. The first Christmas gift that meant anything to him at all was a kayak, which he had taken into the water that very morning, so calm had the sea been, because trouble was so far away. Notice nothing has happened yet. Henry Smith's house, begun in 1678 with the coinage of his 17th century merchant ancestors, stood on stone ledges, braced against the storms and squalls and hurricanes and blizzards that blew out of the northeast. Its beams were still as straight as the day they'd been hewn, and Henry could run his hands along the great oaks that dwelled beneath the flooring and feel the sharp edges left by the ancient maul strokes. The house had been changed and added to and changed again for a century and a half, so that now, under a roof of dark and heavy slate, 3 staircases wound to the 2nd and 3rd floors, and a 4th climbed up until it struck a wall whose ancient framing only suggested the doorway that had once been there. The house's 8 fireplaces were each big enough to stand in, and one had a hidey-hole that huddled beneath the hearth and was guarded by a secret panel in the wood closet. Henry and his brother, Franklin, and his sister Louisa would hide in it during the winter because it was always warm. The floors of the house were wide pine downstairs, wider oak upstairs, quarried stone in the kitchen and the end rooms behind it, and Italian ochre tile in the parlors. Nothing happening yet. The north parlor held lacquered Asian furniture brought back from Hong Kong and Singapore aboard 19th century steamers. The south parlor showed the French Impressionist collection, including 2 Van Goghs and a Renoir. The downstairs was an armory of Revolutionary War flintlocks that the Blytheberry by the Sea Historical Society borrowed for exhibits on the 4th of July, because they all still fired. The library held 2 shelves of medieval prayer books whose gold and red adusums flashed as if they'd just been scripted beneath the stern and glowing icons hanging on the dark paneling. Henry and his father would sometimes read them for the use of this abbey, for the use of this monastery, for the use of this court, and then they would look out towards a gold and red sunset. "This house will stand until the apocalypse," his father would say reverently. Henry believed him. Blytheberry by the Sea had grown up slowly around the Smith house. Now it was a kind of town where no one who lived there worked there. Weekdays, the dark suits commuted in sleek foreign cars to downtown Boston. Henry's father drove to a prestigious and well-regarded accountancy firm where he was a partner. And then the suits came back at supper time, glad to have escaped the noisy crowd of the city. On Sundays, Henry's father went to St. Anne's Episcopal Church, where their family had owned a pew since 1680. And in the afternoons, they took long walks beneath the broad maples of Townsend Park, or drove up to New Hampshire to buy maple syrup. Or if the weather was warm, they climbed down into Savage Cove, the long stretch of perfect white sand, and huge black boulders below their house. Local guidebooks called it the finest private beach on the North Shore. Looking at the shore from the library windows, Henry agreed. Still, nothing has happened. On Monday mornings, Franklin and Louisa drove early to Henry Wadsworth Longfellow Prep School, where no one wore uniforms. 30 minutes later, Henry's parents drove him to the John Greenleaf Whittier Academy, where all 7th and 8th grade students wore uniforms, involving a white shirt, blue blazer, red and white tie, the school colors, khaki pants, black socks, black loafers, and, no kidding, red and white boxers. Longfellow Prep and Whittier Academy were both old schools made of burnt brick and filled with kids whose names were so Anglo-Saxon that King Richard the Lion-Hearted would have recognized all of them. In the fall, they played rugby. In the spring, they rode crew. No one was surprised that Henry, who was one of the smaller rugby players, liked spring a whole lot better than fall, especially since he could never hope to match the records that Franklin Smith, the great lord of us all, Franklin Smith, had put up on the wooden athletic records paneled for his rugby play, which Franklin reminded Henry of whenever he chose to notice him. Blytheberry by the Sea was the kind of town where oaks and maples shaded quiet, clapboard and brick and stone houses that had seen a whole lot of New England winters, and were doing fine, thank you. Tight and prim, their windows presided over Main Street, whose 2 narrow lanes meandered into the town center, where tourists up from Boston and New York came to visit boutiques and rare bookshops, and antique stores, and fancy jewelry artisans, and gourmet delis. Occasionally, one of the town's 2 policemen would stroll past the boutiques and delis and stop and pick up a piece of litter that someone from out of town had dropped, which is about the most they did in a day, because Blytheberry by the Sea was a town that trouble could not find. And still nothing has happened. It goes on a while more, but I won't give it to you. One option that you do have, it seems to me, is to start to break some rules. Do you explode into the action? Absolutely. Do you try and break that every so often? Why not? If you can get away with it. This is from a new book now. I should tell you that I never get my titles, so it's always a sort of disappointment, but anyway, you deal with it. The original title for this book was called Doug's Turn, T-E-R-N. And the motif of the book, the thing that hangs it together, is this, that Doug goes to a new place. This is Doug Swiatek from Wednesday Wars. Goes to a new town. And as he's meandering around the town, or the library in the town, he comes upon something which is really quite remarkable. And it's this. There is an Audubon Birds of America on display in this town's library. In the world, there are 119, this is real now, in the world there are 119 sets of Audubon's Birds of America. Only 119 perfect sets. One of which is going up for sale on December 7th, which I'm not going to be bidding on. And he sees this amazing, amazing book. The other thing that's happening in this town is this, that Audubon's Birds of America, sold together, a first edition, will bring about $8 to $10 million. Audubon's Birds of America, if you take a razor blade and cut out all 435 plates and sell them individually, will bring something close to $25 million. The book is worth more destroyed than it is together. So the story is of Doug, who is going to find this book and realizes that 9 plates have been razor bladed out, and he resolves that he will go and find and return all 9 razor bladed Birds of America out. This is the opening here. On this one, I'm interested in creating a character who's different from Howling Hood. I want his voice to be that of a beat-up kid. I want him to be angry and to be not unwilling to share that anger with you or against you. So this is the opening now. The book is called Okay for Now. Joe Pepitone once gave me his New York Yankees baseball cap. I am not lying. He gave it to me, Doug Swiatek, to me. Joe Pepitone and Horace Clark came all the way out to the island to Camillo Junior High, and I threw with them, me and Danny Hupfer and Howling Hood, who were good guys. We all threw with Joe Pepitone and Horace Clark, and we batted too. They sang to us while we swung away. He's a batter, he's a batter, 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 he's a batter. That was their song. And afterward, Horace Clark gave Danny his cap, and Joe Pepitone gave Howling his jacket, probably because he felt sorry for him on account of his dumb name. And then Joe Pepitone handed me his cap. He reached out and took it off his head, and he handed it to me, just like that. It was signed on the inside, so anyone could tell it was really his, Joe Pepitone's. It was the only thing I ever owned that hadn't belonged to some other Swiatek before me. I hid it for 4.5 months. Then my stupid brother found out about it. He came in at night when I was asleep and whipped my arm up behind my back so high I couldn't even scream, it hurt so bad. And he told me to decide if I wanted a broken arm or if I wanted to give him Joe Pepitone's baseball cap. I decided on the broken arm. Then he stuck his knee in the center of my spine and asked if I wanted a broken back along with a broken arm, and so I told him Joe Pepitone's cap was in the basement behind the oil furnace. It wasn't, but he went downstairs anyway. That's what a chump he is. So I threw on a t-shirt and shorts and Joe Pepitone's cap, which was under my pillow the whole time, the jerk, and got outside, except he caught me, dragged me behind the garage, took Joe Pepitone's baseball cap, pummeled me in places where the bruises wouldn't show, a strategy that is none of your business. I think he kept the cap for 10 hours, just long enough for me to see him with it at school. Then he traded it to Link Vitelli for cigarettes, and Link Vitelli kept it for a day, just long enough for me to see him with it at school. Then Link traded it to Glenn Dillard for a comb. And Glenn Dillard kept it for a day, just long enough for me to see him with it at school. Then Glenn lost it while driving his brother's Mustang without a license and with the top down, the jerk. It blew off somewhere on Jerusalem Avenue. I looked for it for a week. I guess now it's in a gutter, getting rained on or something. Probably anyone who walks by looks down and thinks it's a piece of junk. They're right. That's all it is now. But once, it was the only thing I ever owned that hadn't belonged to some other Swiatek before me. I know. That means a whole big fat 0 to anyone else. I tried to talk to my father about it, but it was a wrong day. Most days are wrong days. Most days he comes home red-faced with his eyes half closed and with that deadly silence that lets you know he'd have a whole lot to say if he ever let himself get started. And no one better let him get started, because there's no telling when he'll stop. And if he ever did get started, then pretty Mr. Culross at freaking Culross Lumber better not be the one to get him started, because he'd punch pretty Mr. Culross. This is hard to read. Because he'd punch pretty Mr. Culross's freaking lights out, and he didn't care if he did lose his job over it, because it's a lousy job anyway. That was my father not letting himself get started. But I had a plan. All I had to do was get my father to take me to Yankee Stadium. That's all. If I could just see Joe Pepitone one more time. If he could just tell me what happened, if I could just tell him what happened to my baseball cap, he'd look at me, and he'd laugh and rough up my hair, and then he'd take off his cap and he'd put it on my head. "Here, Doug," Joe Pepitone would say, like that. "Here, Doug, you look a whole lot better in it than I do." That's what Joe Pepitone would say. That's the kind of guy he is. That was the plan. All I had to do was get my father to listen. But I picked the wrong day, because there aren't any right days. And my father said, "Are you crazy? Are you freaking crazy? I work 45 hours a week to put food on the table for you, and you want me to take you to Yankee Stadium because you lost some lousy baseball cap? It's not just some lousy..." That's all I got out. My father's hands are quick. That's the kind of guy he is. Who knows how much my father got out the day he finally let himself get started saying what he wanted to say to pretty Mr. Culross, and didn't even try to stop himself from saying it. But whatever he said, he came home with a pretty good shiner, because pretty Mr. Culross turned out to have hands even quicker than my father's. And pretty Mr. Culross had one other big advantage. He could fire my father if he wanted to. So my father came home with his lunch pail in his hand and a bandage on his face, and the last check he would ever see from Culross Lumber Incorporated. And he looked at my mother and said, "Don't say a thing." And he looked at me and said, "Still worried about a lousy baseball cap?" And he went upstairs and started making phone calls. Mom kept us in the kitchen. He came down when we were finishing supper, and Mom jumped up from the table and brought over the plate she'd been warming in the oven. She set it down in front of him. "It's not all dried out, is it?" he said. "I don't think so," Mom said. "You don't think so," he said, and took off the aluminum foil, sighed, and reached for the ketchup. He smeared it all over his meatloaf. Thick. Took a red bite. "We're moving," he said. Chewed. "Moving?" said my mother. "To Marysville, upstate." Another red bite. Chewing. "Ballard Paper Mill has a job, and Ernie Echo says he can get me in." "Ernie Echo," said my mother quietly. "Don't you start about him," said my father. "So it will begin all over again. I said, the bars, gone all night, coming back home when you're..." My father stood up. "Which of your sons will it be this time?" my mother said. My father looked at me. I put my eyes down and worked at what was left of my meatloaf. There will be one more book in the grouping of the Wednesday Wars books. That one's out in March. This is called The Complete Literary Correspondence of Merrill Lee Kowalski, and it's a book that follows Merrill Lee. I've always wanted to do an epistolary novel. Never knew what to do on this. I love these kind of novels. The form of the novel began with epistolary novels, a series of letters. Most epistolary novels have letters to and from people, and I thought it'd be interesting as a narrative problem to only have letters from one person. So this is a book which is about 2/3 done, which is essentially a series of letters from Merrill Lee to various people. You have to decide or have to discern as a reader what the return letters have said. She has just left to go to a prep school on the North Shore of Massachusetts. And this is the one that can stink, because it's just a rough draft. So if it really stinks, that's why. This is called Safety. September 9th, 1968, Monday. Dear Holling, you are a poophead. Do you not get that when you tell someone that you're going to write to her as soon as she gets to St. Helena's, that it means that you have to write to her as soon as you get to St. Helena's? Don't you get that? I'm here. I'm waiting. No letter from Holling. You poophead. So this is what happens right after supper. Right after evening meal. Mrs. Louisa Todd Allen, who is a dragon, speaks to us her words of accomplishment. Mrs. Hannah Adams Mott, the associate headmistress, leads us in the school song. I'm not going to tell you the words. You would throw up. After that, Mrs. Kellogg, who is an associate or something like that, reads to us an uplifting passage from the classics. And while all that accomplishing and uplifting is going on, one of the girls who works here is delivering our mail to the little boxes off the main lobby. So when we leave after evening meal, everyone is walking very fast to these little boxes because we want to hear from the outside world. And everyone who has a letter pulls it out and makes a big show of it. So tonight I reached into my box and pulled out my letter, and Jennifer Hartley Truro, who has a whole town on Cape Cod named after her, pulls out her letter. And then Jennifer Hartley Truro opens her letter and squeals this high squeal like what pigs do when they die. And she tells everyone that she has another letter, another wonderful letter from Alden. Dear Alden, stupendous, magnificent Alden. And she wishes that she could read it out loud to everyone, but Alden, wonderful Alden, dear Alden, would never want her to share their secrets. Upchuck, 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 upchuck. So then all these girls who want to be Jennifer Hartley Truro more than they want their next breath squeal like dying pigs too. And isn't Jennifer Hartley Truro lucky to have wonderful Alden, dear Alden, handsome Alden? And is it really true that his family owns estates and manor houses and castles all over Scotland? But Jennifer Hartley Truro only holds her letter to her heart, smiles, and doesn't tell. Alden would never want her to share their secrets. Squeal, 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 squeal. Upchuck, 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 upchuck. So then Jennifer Hartley Truro allows her eye to wander to me, and she asks like she really wants to know, "Who's your letter from, Merrilee?" And everyone gets quiet. I say, "It's probably from her mommy and daddy because they don't want her to be homesick," says Jennifer Hartley Truro, which is sort of fun. She smiles at me kind of sadly and sweetly, and I want to punch out 4 of her perfect white teeth. And what am I supposed to say? Because it is from my mom. "This is your fault, Holling. You are a poophead. Write as soon as you get this letter or you die, poophead. Sincerely yours, Merrilee." September 11th, 1968, Wednesday. Dear poophead, death draweth nigh. Sincerely yours, Merrilee. September 13th, 1968, Friday. Dear poophead, you sent such a long letter that it stuffed up my whole mailbox. I had to pull with both hands to get it out. I had to put my foot up against the wall for leverage. I had to ask Mrs. Kellogg for a crowbar. In case it doesn't translate, Holling, this is called sarcasm. But you're lucky your letter came. Because while I was opening yours, Jennifer Hartley Truro was opening her 2 letters. Did you catch that number, Holling? Her 2 letters from Alden, dear Alden, wonderful Alden. And one of them had a picture of him in his tweeds, and the other one was a picture of him in his kilt. But Jennifer Hartley Truro would not pass either of them around because, if you remember, Alden would never want her to share their secrets. Squeal, 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 squeal. My favorite classes are famous women of history, and yes, Holling, there are a lot more than you and Danny think. And life sciences with Mrs. Bellamy, which I know sounds dull as rocks, but isn't. My worst class is domestic economy, taught by Mrs. Wiss, who is a dragonette. I'm not really sure what this class is supposed to be about, but so far it seems to be about how to grow up and marry someone like Alden. And then there's Latin with Mr. Wheelock. Upchuck, 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 upchuck. I have 3 roommates who have all gone to St. Eleanor's Prep School for girls since the 4th grade and who have roomed with each other for the whole time and who wish like anything that they were rooming with Stephanie DeLacy again this year, except that Stephanie DeLacy is living in Romania for 2 years since her father's a UN diplomat, and so they're stuck with me. They wish I was dead. I wish they were dead. The food is okay. We sit at assigned tables with one of the teachers. I have Mrs. Bellingham, my history teacher. And she keeps reminding us that our spines should not touch the back of our chairs, that we're not supposed to bend down to eat our peas, and we start with the fork farthest to the left and stuff like that. Jennifer Hartley Truro is at my table. What happiness surrounds me. Last night, she wore pearls to evening meal. You don't happen to have an extra string of pearls lying around, do you? I'm sorry about the cross-country race, Holling, I really am. I wish I'd been there. But at least your mother and Heather were there to see you get the medal. Sincerely yours, Merrilee. September 16th, 1968, Monday. Dear my T, thank you for your letter. I can't tell you how good it is to hear any news about Camilla Junior High. There is a high wall around St. Elena's with wrought iron spikes along the top. It's supposed to make us feel cloistered from the world, according to the headmistress here. It makes me feel like I'm in jail. It sounds like the Labor Day party was pretty bad. What Danny's mother said is awful, but don't you think Danny was noble standing up to her like that? Maybe they just don't understand what it sounds like to you when they talk about Vietnam. They've never been refugees. Maybe they don't even know what happened to your family. If they did, Danny's mother wouldn't have said it. It was sweet of Danny to bring the rose over to your house. Maybe you could tell him to remind Holling that there's a certain someone whose birthday is coming up, and for not a whole lot, he can wire flowers to the North Shore. No, don't say anything. Holling will never remember birthdays. That's just the way he is. Poophead. You asked what we were reading in English. Mrs. Connolly believes that each of us should propose a book that we would like to study this semester so that we will learn how to develop taste and discernment. Jennifer Hartley Truro told her that she would like to read the collected poetry of Alfred Lord Tennyson. Mrs. Connolly smiled at her like she was standing in the presence of a prize student who will one day bring her teacher fame and glory. That would be lovely, Jennifer, said Mrs. Connolly. Just lovely. What a wise and sensitive choice. Upchuck, 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 upchuck. Then I told her that I would like to read The Grapes of Wrath. And Mrs. Connolly did this thing with her nose and said that John Steinbeck is a lewd communist, and no student of hers will be reading anything by that man. So I'm reading The Grapes of Wrath, alone in the library, and I keep my domestic economy books around me to throw them over if Mrs. Connolly comes by. I haven't gotten to the lewd parts yet, but I'll let you know as soon as I do. Yours, Merrill Lee. Thank you, folks. Stop with that.